Yeah? Shall we? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to this Science Business Conference titled Brave New World, Building Europe's Capacity for Defense and Security R&D. My name is Marilyn Fieschi. I'm the CEO of Science Business, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. Welcome those in the room, welcome those watching online. We'll have a very full program, so I'll tell you more about it in a second. But just to introduce Science Business quickly, I know some of you come here for the first time, but that's probably because we go deeper into an area that we haven't covered much in past years, but that we are and will cover more and more in coming months, no doubt. So Science Business is a news company. We specialize in research and innovation policy in Europe and in an international landscape as well. We actually cover policy and funding the various R&D projects. The policy coverage kept us busy for the past 20 years, and in the last month, recently, we launched another news track that is called the Funding Newswire, and that really specializes in funding, in R&D funding. And it's designed to help researchers and stakeholders navigate the very complex research and R&D funding world, or maze, as we call it. We also run a network that brings together about 80 organizations, including leading research universities, public sector research centers, multinationals, associations, government agencies. So we're not picky, we have many type of organizations, and we like to think that we are a very unique club by bringing all these different worlds together. And for our members, and with our members, I should say, we organize regularly closed-door events, public conferences around some of the hottest research and innovation-related topics. And today is no exception. So while Europe is still dealing with the aftermath of COVID, it also had to deal with a war on its doorstep, another war in the Middle East, and a global geopolitical context that have provoked a complete reshuffle of Europe's policy priorities, but also a complete change of rhetoric, right? Autonomy, sovereignty, resilience, security, all have made it their way up to the top of the political guidelines of this new commission. The Council today, the EU leaders are meeting today to talk about pretty much all of that. Yeah, that's why there is the police out there. It's not for us. That's for them, right? For the first time in the College of Commissioners, there will be a commissioner for defense. So the message is loud and clear. For the first time in a very long time, I think we can say for the last 30 years, maybe, the end of the Cold War, Europe needs to go through a deep rethink of its place in the geopolitical landscape. It needs to rethink its external dependencies. It needs to rethink its risk exposure to global supply chains, right? And, well, Europe will not be able to deliver on its defense and security ambitions without a strong economic basis. And as pointed out by the Letta report on the single market, yeah, it's report season, the Letta report on the single market, the Draghi report on competitiveness, the ATOR report that was released yesterday on the future of the framework program for research, well, all of these priorities need to go hand in hand with significant investment in R&D, or research and innovation, I should say. But when it comes to research, to security R&D, plenty of questions arise, and there are so many that I need to look at my notes. So where do security investment need to flow? and through which funding vehicles? Are member states prepared to spend whatever it takes for Europe to actually deliver on its defense and security objectives? Can the defense and security agenda turn into a driver of innovation, especially in the fields of health and digital? How to deal with dual-use research? What does the future hold for international cooperation in defense and security R&I? Can Europe keep being picky with who to work with around sensitive technologies, for instance? And last but not least, how are all these questions going to translate into the revamped European Defence Fund, the next iteration of the EU Framework Programme for Research and Innovation, or the so-called FP10, and, or I should say, the EU Competitiveness Fund, right? So we'll see all of that. As I said, we have plenty to cover. The menu is very dense, and we're going to have plenty of time for networking, so that's also a good news. And to take us through the proceeding, I'll hand over to my colleague in the second, but before I do that, I want to thank again the members of the Science Business Network for their continuous support, and thank the two partners of this conference, Novartis and Avio Aereo. All right, so we're ready to go, and with this, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague Simon Pickard, Network Director, who's going to take us through the opening session. A word of warning, in the first panel, there are only men. Sorry, it's the only one, I swear. So don't start going on LinkedIn and Twitter saying, oh, another conference with men only. No, no, don't. This is all due to last-minute reshuffle, and it's the only one. You'll see women throughout the day. Simon, I hand over to you, and welcome again to everyone.
So thank you, Marilyn, and welcome to all of you. As Marilyn has said, we've got quite a packed agenda today. I'm very pleased that we do coincidentally have a health security session, given that the last-minute reshuffles Marilyn alluded to is largely due to people getting COVID or viruses or lumbago or other kinds of ailments which have prevented people from traveling to Brussels today. So we've had a little reshuffle at the beginning of the program, but just to explain, the context of our first session remains the same. We're talking about defense tech strategy, and as Marilyn has mentioned in the opening remarks, we live in interesting times, according to the old Chinese proverb. Unprecedented levels of geopolitical turbulence for the last 30 years at least, conflict on the doorstep of Europe, and in parallel, technology domains which are emerging and developing at an unprecedented rate. So against this incredibly volatile and unpredictable backdrop, how do decision makers think about defense tech strategy for a very uncertain future? That's really the strapline for our opening session, which will run until about 11:30. Within that, we're going to look at various aspects of the NATO strategy on science and tech. We're going to look at the EU policy context and the new mandate and how things may change. We have rhetoric. Let's see how we get reality in the next 5 years. And we're also going to be hearing some industry perspectives on what this means for some of Europe's leading developers and producers of defense technology. How can this ecosystem actually evolve in a coherent, synergistic way, to borrow Brussels' favorite word? And how do we avoid the fragmentation and silos and national interests that have defined a lot of aspects of the defense ecosystem in recent years? So, to inspire, inform, and enlighten, I'd like to invite our four guests to come to the stage. First, Michael Froneberg, Head of NATO and EU Relations at KNDS. Michael, you take whichever seat you wish. Next, David Luengo, who's the Managing Director of the Brussels office for Indra. Welcome, David. After him, Michalis Ketselidis, who's the Senior Expert for Defense Industry at Space at the Secretariat General of the European Commission. Last but by no means least, Dr. Bryan Wells, Chief Scientist and Chair of the NATO Science and Technology Board. And to build on Marilyn's last observation, we will do our best to be empathetic, sensitive, and avoid mansplaining at all moments during the panel. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with a slightly provocative question, just to get everybody into the discussion as quickly as possible. In the context of President von der Leyen's new political guidelines and the mission letters to her commissioners designate, defense and security is one of the top priorities, with a goal that in 5 years' time, we will have made significant progress in Europe in defense and security domains. So my question is, if we look ahead to 2029, 2030, how prepared do you think Europe will be to defend itself? Bryan, let's start with you.
Thank you. And to start also with a slightly provocative comment, the NATO Science and Technology Organization's initiative on women and girls in science has been awarded a European award for the most impactful initiative in this year.
Congratulations, well done.
Are we ready? From a scientific perspective, I would say yes. Why do I say that? Because the defense and security science and technology in both NATO and the EU entities are done by scientists in the nations. Quite often it's the same scientists, and that's a very good way of avoiding duplication. The same scientists don't have the same time, don't have enough time. The nations don't have enough money to duplicate. Next point, if we look at the rankings of universities, I usually take the Shanghai annual index of the rankings of top universities. This year's, from August of this year, the top 20 universities in the world are all on the soil of NATO allies. And we all know that there's very good interactions between European member states and our colleagues in North America as well. So if we think where our cutting edge is, it's in the excellence of our academic institutions, it's in the excellence of our national scientists. They work for NATO, they work for the entities in the European Union. I think Europe collectively is in a good place to do that.
Okay, well, it's always good to start on a positive note. Michalis, let's hear from you. What's the take on this from the Secretariat General?
Yes, your question was how prepared do I think Europe will be to defend itself? It will never be fully prepared, but no one can be fully prepared, because if you think you're fully prepared, this gives a notion of complacency, and this can be dangerous. However, first of all, look at how much defense spending rises. Poland, for example, this year passed 4.1% of their GDP, and they announced next year they go to 4.7%. But if I look at the EU, where I'm working at, the defense preparedness now is a thing. It was not before. This was a centralization of the European defense industrial strategy. For the first time, we talk about defense preparedness. And actually, the president, in her political guidelines, she asked for a preparedness union strategy. This is you. So the president also asked for a European Defense Union. President Juncker has said it's 10 years now, but now she asked to build a true one. And she announced that she will come up with a white paper on the future of European defense in the first 100 days. So this shows that this is one of the top priorities. We'll also have the 3 reports of 3 wise men to build upon. Draghi, Letta, Niinisto. They asked for a common market for defense. They say that defense sector is a key driver for innovation. They suggest to take bold steps to increase financing and promote civil-military cooperation to strengthen societal resilience. So resilience becomes strong. And finally, central to this work will be to strengthen the EU-NATO cooperation. That's my take.
Okay. But do you think we'll be prepared in 5 years?
Much better. That's what I said. We'll be much better than before, but we'll never be fully prepared. One should never seek full.
Understood. Okay, let's hear what industry thinks. So, David, let's start with you. How do you look at the preparedness agenda for the next 5 years from Indra's perspective?
Well, thanks a lot, first of all, for having invited me. I'm very, very happy to be here. I think this is one of the main debates today, at least in Brussels. Not sure that in some capitals this is a debate still, but it depends on what side of the European continent you look at. And this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. The European Union is a project that was not done for be prepared for this kind of threats that we live today. The geopolitical context today has changed dramatically. And I remember very well that in December 2013, there was a European Council which conclusions started by saying defense matters. 2013. 11 years later, we are still trying to understand what do we want to do and what do we want to be in this domain. I think things have evolved very rapidly in relative terms. If defense was a taboo 10 years ago, today's defense sector, the defense ecosystem, is an ecosystem that is very much normalized in terms of policy and in terms of funding. Using the EU budget for this has been already something that is mature, I would say. We can discuss later. But are we prepared? I don't think so. And this is precisely why we are trying to put many efforts, many instruments, policy, funding, talking to the ecosystem, trying to find a way to be competitive, resilient, and be prepared.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, Michael, let's round off the panel with the opening question.
All right, thanks a lot for the invitation as well. I can very much agree with what you've said. I think a very first step for being prepared is focusing on something, and I think the key question, are we really focused on defending Europe? I would say we have very much analyzed the problem from various points of view, and I think we are, I would also fully agree, we are the, this is going to sound arrogant, the smart kids in the room, but you know what happens to the smart kids on the schoolyard, right? They tend to be the ones who get pushed around, so I'm not sure if it's helpful if we're going to be the ones who have all the greatest ideas, if we're going to stay there. The funding discussion is, I think, the big elephant in the room. We have talked, I think we've said all the right words of how it is important to invest in defense. I think investing in defense right now in Europe consists of two things. One is investing in supporting Ukraine. One is investing in doing the homework we've saved on for about 30 years at least. I think the EU is doing, considering that it's 27 member states talking to each other and trying to find solutions, it's doing a very good job in supporting Ukraine. However, I think all the defense discussions are right now focused on Ukraine, and we are, if you look into national budgets, at least in Germany, for example, that is an evolution and not a revolution, and it's a very slow evolution. And we're putting very much effort into calculating that we are meeting the 2% goal for NATO, whereas countries like Poland are doing a lot more, as you said. So I think it's a very much divided discussion depending on where you're from. So if you go to Eastern European Conference, you're going to meet a completely different defense bubble than here. And I think the further east you go, the larger the question mark is going to be, how serious are we actually leading this discussion? And if we're not leading it seriously, we're not going to be prepared by 2030.
Okay, yeah. Fantastic. Now, you've mentioned a lot about the EU context, but I'd like to take a few minutes to help us understand the NATO context, because NATO, obviously under Bryan's group and in other parts of the ecosystem, is doing a huge amount around science and tech development, but it's not widely known to the outside world. So before we come back to some of the big European questions, Bryan, maybe give us a very quick overview on how this science and technology ecosystem in NATO works.
Perfect, thanks, Simon. So NATO Science and Technology Organization has three bodies. There's the Office of the Chief Scientist up the road, I might say, towards the airport. We are about 15 people strong, and that office supports me in my dual role as scientific advisor to NATO leadership and also chair of the NATO Science and Technology Board, which is made up of the Defence Science and Technology Directors of the Allies. We have an office in Paris that is about 50 strong. That coordinates our collaborative programme of work, which I'll come back to in a moment. NATO also has its own laboratory, the Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation at La Spezia in Italy, which undertakes, as its name suggests, maritime science and technology, but also climate change, maritime climate change as well. Let me look at our collaborative programme of work. That's the workhorse of the NATO Science and Technology Organisation. This comprises a network of about 5,000 scientists and engineers in the Allies, but also like-minded partners, particularly Australia and Japan, and we're widening that network as well. At any one time, we have about 400 projects underway, covering the full range of science needed for defence, everything from autonomy, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, military health issues as well. This equates to about 400 million euros a year. Now, this is national money, it's not NATO money, and I think that's one of the differences in the model between NATO and the EU. So essentially, nations pay for the participation of their own scientists and their laboratory capabilities. The 5,000 scientists come mainly from government defence laboratories, but we've also got a good range of academia and industry participation as well. So that, in a nutshell, I would say is the NATO Science and Technology Organisation. We try to be as open as possible. If you search NATO Science and Technology Organisation, you will find a homepage. I know NATO can be quite opaque, but we try to be as open as possible in that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for setting the context. When we talked before the conference, obviously one of the key questions also for this session, but the event at large, is this question of anticipation.
Yep.
Right? Not just in terms of the complexity and the spectrum of technologies involved in defense and security, but mapping that onto the geopolitical environment.
Yep.
So how do you address this challenge of horizon scanning and anticipation within the Science and Technology Organization?
Thank you. So every 2 years, we publish a Science and Technology Trends publication. The last one was 2023, and planning is well underway for the 2025 publication. This takes a 20-year look at how we assess that science will evolve and its implications for NATO, both from the position of the NATO allies and to the extent that we can in a public document, and I'll return to that in a moment, the extent that we can on how it will affect the threats that NATO will face. We get this information from two primary sources. The first is the results of the work from our scientific network. Quite often those are not only just looking at specific military and security problems, but also they are themselves looking out to the future. We've recently completed a long-term scientific study on chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense, for example, looking at how technologies are changing. So we have this body of work that we can draw on. We also have an artificial intelligence-enabled search engine which can search open source publications, and we're looking there for what we call weak signals. In other words, research that's being undertaken in some laboratories around the world, which may be the next generation of emerging technologies. And the 2023 publication was in 2 volumes, deliberately public release, not least so that we could share it with the institutions of the European Union. We're also undertaking a very fruitful exchange both at staff level and at Chief Scientist DG level with the Joint Research Centre on sharing our notes on foresight and horizon scanning.
So within this context, what about the combination of technologies? Because I think, whether we're looking at, seabed threats, whether we're looking at hybrid, complex AI plus autonomous, how do you deal with this aspect of science and technology planning?
This is really important. Very rarely do you get game changers from a single technology. It's a combination of technologies, as you rightly say. There's no point having an artificial intelligence algorithm unless you've got big data to train it on. And equally, once you've got that, there's not much point in having it unless you've got an autonomous platform to put it on. So I find that the combination of artificial intelligence, big data, and autonomy is an all-pervasive combination of technologies that are important. But there are others that we need to think about. Synthetic biology is, we predict, the next game changer after artificial intelligence. But if you add artificial intelligence to synthetic biology, you both get new opportunities, particularly in the manufacture of novel materials. You also get new threats that you need to defend against. So it is this combination of technologies that is so important. And as I say, artificial intelligence, big data, and autonomy is all pervasive in the defence and security sector.
Well noted. Thank you for that. Now, we're going to come back to you a little later to talk about research security with other members of the panel. But let's move on to the EU policy context and Michalis, because obviously at the level of the SecGen, I guess exciting times in the sense of the reorganization of the College of Commissioners, the new mandate with all of these cross-cutting ambitions that have implications for all kinds of services within the Commission. And when we talked again before the conference, you came up with a great strapline. What happens when geopolitics meet technology in this new age, these new realities? So where are we today in terms of the preparations for the new mandate and how you think fundamental changes will happen in the EU approach to defense and sec technology?
Let me start with a small story. When I started working in the Commission 30 years ago, it was in the research part. And I was surprised how disconnected research and science was with the mainstream policies. People who were working on those, on external relations, on trade, they were coming from different disciplines, and for them science was important but too complicated to understand. I had felt it, and I can tell stories about it. Actually, some others felt it, so I was seconded for 6 years from ISPRA, where I was in Brussels, to act as a scientific interface. So actually translate the policy needs in the jargon of those in Brussels to requirements for the scientists to help with. So things changed since then. The first thing that made it change was the crisis we had to deal with 20 years ago. We had and those crises needed evidence-based analysis. Think of the avian flu, think of tsunami in Indonesia and Japan, think of the volcano explosion in Iceland, think of COVID. Responses to those crises asked for scientific analysis and rigid suggestions to go forward. So this was the first time where science and mainstream policy came together. But actually, it is in the last few years that geopolitics and technologies met, really, what I told you before. And why is that? There is a recognition that the globalization of trade and investment brought certain security risks with it, so we now have to address. There's the return of high-intensity war in Europe and in the Middle East, where we actually see use of technology that goes from using a smart way commercial drones to much more sophisticated solutions now. We have economic pressures, including inflation, energy dependencies, cross-border health threats, critical infrastructure incidents, including sabotage. that, and the need for a post-pandemic recovery. We have a need for urgent action for the phasing out of fossil fuels and the EU's commitment to Green Deal and climate neutrality. So it's such a vast, if you look at it, if you think of it. And in addition, we have the transformation of economies that by global digitalization, the progress of AI, biotech, etc. So all of this means that technological sovereignty at the heart of this political discussion, something that was not conceivable 20 years ago. So there are calls to decrease our dependence, strengthen and retain the critical technologies, to make sure that we keep our welfare and prosperity. For all of that, to put it in a context, the Commission presented in 23 the economic security strategy, that talks about trade, investment, dual-use critical technologies, inbound investments, outbound investments, export controls, and maybe we'll have some time to talk about that later on. And I just close by how you started. Technology and geopolitics met, and this promises to be a long relationship.
Okay, that's a great way of framing it. Thank you very much. So there has been a growing recognition of the constraints and the limitations, based on existing treaties and programs and legislation about what the Commission can do today to support defense and security technology and research and development. As we go into the new mandate, what do you see as the primary role for the Commission, both in scaling up and accelerating the activities that you can do now, and also thinking ahead to the next multi-annual financial framework and the way that defense and security technologies might be supported beyond 2028?
As a smart public servant, I would have to wait for the new commissioners to be in place and get the guidance to tell you what will happen in the next 5 years. But what I can tell you is based on what the President already announced in the political guidelines and what is going on, and it's safe to assume that we will continue. So we expect to have more support for R&D, and including defense innovation. We will see more incentives for joint procurement in Europe. This will address the fragmentation of the industry in Europe and will make prices more interesting. We will see more support for ramping up defense production. The Ukraine experience showed us that our defense production of ammunition of equipment was not up to the task, and so we need to make sure that European defense industry is able to produce what is needed. And then, as the President announced, we expect a more focused, simpler, and more impactful budget. So we will expect to have less financial instruments than before. The President announced the European Competitiveness Fund, which will probably bring in several of the instruments that we have today. And given its size, that will allow to leverage national, private, and institutional financing. It will give an extra muscle to the EU budget. And this will also allow us to work more with the European Investment Bank Group, not only in dual use, where it already opened up and we're planning to work together, but also in the future, where we expect to raise the exclusion policy and allow support of military equipment.
Super, thank you. That's a very good bridge into the next part of the conversation with Michael and David. So Michalis has highlighted some of the key commitments that are in the political guidelines for increased investment, for scaling up of certain instruments. But if we take a step back, right, and you put on the perspectives of leading defense technology companies in Europe, when we think about the MFF, for example, from 2028, if the money arrives, what do we spend it on? Where do we focus? I think it's a, as you said, the elephant in the room, Michael. Maybe you'd like to take this one first, and then Perhaps, David, we'll come back to the question about how this is channeled into different R&D instruments to promote science and tech development. But Michael, on the budget question, the money.
All right. I think what's happening right now is there's a lot of hope of the next MFF being the game changer, whereas reality does not truly show that, because, to be honest, resilience of societies is not a defense topic. It's an energy topic, it's a social topic, it's all over the place. I think the challenge we have in the 21st century is that everything is connected to everything. And if we're going to talk putting all energy into defending Europe, then we're also going to very quickly talk about risking the comfort zone of the way we live. And I think the challenge these days is that this tends to be an either-or discussion, whereas we probably have to think these things together, which my take is the MFF is not going to be the big radical change towards defense, because that would mean taking money away from other very important areas. That then means if we're talking about the same amount of money, and the EU spends about, in terms of defense, it spends about 1% of what EU member states are spending on defense on an annual basis, which means the incentives they are providing are politically very important symbolic signs, but they are, at least for the bigger companies, it's going to be, I'm very sure, money everybody's going to be happy to take along. But the question that remains, is that a real game changer for Europe? I mean, right now we have the EDF that focuses on about, I would say, 250 projects at the same time. We have PESCO that focuses on 72 projects at the same time. And with that amount of number, it leads to the automatic question, do we focus at all? There was a very good paper from the EU gaps analysis, which I think stated very clearly what we really need. And there's another statement, I think, that originally came from NATO, the analysis of how many military systems we have in the United States versus what's flying and driving and sailing around in Europe. And so, once again, the analyses are very clear that we need to focus more. I just don't see the EU programs at the moment doing that. I think especially if we're not going to have more money, it makes a lot of sense to, and that's a challenge because you have to bring, it's not the EU Commission, it's the 27 member states. The 27 states are going to have to come together and find solutions, what's really important for everybody. That means I think there's a lot of projects where there's going to be a lot of very national interests. I can talk about main battle tanks. We had the most beautiful discussion on that last year. Maybe that's not the right projects to talk about on the EU level then. I think there's a very, very high top level group of topics that interest everybody, and there's a very down in the supply chain level of projects that are interesting for everybody without automatically becoming very political discussions quickly. Maybe if I were to focus on things, I think that would be my thing.
So the areas that are very much EU interest rather than national level or specific companies. Okay, David, what's your take on this? I mean, in terms of the broader investment landscape, obviously the EU funding is an important part, but I think, as you mentioned earlier, there's been a normalization of defense security ecosystem as a potential landing place for investment. So what would you like to see happen in the next few years, either through EU instruments with this focus to support defense tech development, or changes in the broader investment landscape to crowd in more private actors, bringing the capital we need to scale?
Raise a hand if I take too much time. But this is an interesting and inspiring debate, but very complex and very wide. We are talking about a lot of things here today. From an industrial point of view, and I think it deserves to be an industrial approach, because this is a competence that the European Commission has in a way, if you realize that all the financial instruments that are put on the table since 2013 have as a legal base, those who live in Brussels know that the legal base is the key element to unleash a policy. The legal base of the European Defence Industry Programme is Article 173 of the Treaty Functioning of the European Union, which is industrial policy. It's not defence policy, it is industrial policy. So, being industrial policy, the European Commission, which is an external agent, if you allow me, or a facilitator,
Careful here.
a facilitator between 27 member states, part of them with a very national approach towards the industries. This is something that you don't do it overnight. To do what? For me, there are two things. One is to incentivize cooperation. I mean, it is not acceptable to have the degree of efficiency we have now in the European Union as regards defense capabilities. You know the numbers. We cannot have 6 fighter jets, 17 tanks, I don't know how many frigates. It's not acceptable, but it's not acceptable for the EU taxpayer, all of us. So please organize yourself, be more efficient, and make more value for money. So cooperation and incentivized cooperation is the key. And cooperation to be smart enough to set up standards, to set up modus operandis, to set up way of working in order to facilitate interoperability, compatibility, additionality, as you wish. The second point for me is that we need to invest a lot, and the MFF is not enough. It will never be enough. We need to unleash the full power of finance that we have in Europe, public and private. Public and private. And for me, the private investment will come if the private investors, who have seen now that this sector has been normalized at the policy level, they need to find what is in it for me. Is it profitable? An investor, this is the first question they ask. So we need to, and for being profitable, first you need to be competitive. You need to have good quality. You need to know how to compete in the market. First, you need a market, maybe. So, in the end, cooperation and investment to be competitive are of the essence. And to finish, competitiveness through what? I feel that coming back to the nexus technology, geopolitics, technology has always been, but has become now a factor of power. In the current geopolitical context, I mean, we cannot be shy. There is a global strategic competition out there between the United States of America, China, and all the rest who are trying to understand what is their position. And the European Union has decided that we cannot be dependent in certain things. We had the experience of COVID. We were not able to produce masks. Don't forget that, please. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We realized that we are fully dependent on others. I'm not saying that we need to have full control of everything, but there are certain dependencies that are not acceptable. Acceptable by whom? By the EU taxpayer, by the European citizen. If you want to have well-being, a society based on well-being and democratic principles, you need to have a certain power today as regards technology. So we need to invest precisely in those technologies that we feel that are going to be the enablers for having democratic defense, values, society, well-being, etc., etc.
Great, thank you. Michael, you want to add something
If
quickly?
I can just add to the first point you made, I mean, there's a lot of things where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have NATO here who have defined quite a lot of standards already. The weakness of those standards is that they are voluntary standards. I mean, the EU is able to define what a banana is supposed to look like, right? So,
Don't tell the Brits.
but what I'm trying to say is, if those standards exist, I mean, I'm sure you will have to take a step analyzing which standards make sense to basically put into a legal framework. But I mean, that is a very not cost-intensive step that would make a huge difference in terms of interoperability, for example.
Great.
And
thank
it
you.
would also link up NATO and EU as a side thing. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's then bring that back first to Bryan and then also to Michalis. I mean, on this question of international cooperation, Bryan, I mean, the practical reality is that many NATO members are members of the EU. With the political context of the EU versus the way things work in NATO, are there any silver bullets that you can pass down the road from Evora to here, to the human roundabout, about how to make these cooperation mechanisms work more effectively for building consensus, for getting commitment to long-term joint projects? How do you address this challenge of the international cooperation? And then I think for Michalis, just to pick up on what David and Michael have been saying in the context of the defense industrial strategy, you know, what's the best way forward in terms of directionality? Is it on standards? Is it the, you know, sustainable finance taxonomy? Where can the EU bring its weight to bear to normalize and to create a more effective investment landscape? But let's start with Bryan on the international cooperation angle.
Thanks for that. So far as international cooperation is concerned, I think NATO as NATO up the road and EU as EU here, we're making good progress. We're sharing ideas both in terms of technology trends, but also more generally on foresight as well. So far as individual projects are concerned, as I say, given the overlap of the EU member states and the NATO allies, there's no interest in the nations working in NATO to duplicate with the EU and the other way round. My experience is that actually practical cooperation and avoidance of duplication is working pretty well. So far as industrial cooperation is concerned, I agree that interoperability is the key. It's that NATO allies can interoperate and EU member states can work together, and clearly standardization, interoperability is the way to promote that. I have a particular interest from the scientific perspective, because if the nations in whatever body cooperate together scientifically, that is ensuring that interoperability is baked in right from the beginning, once the science is then exploited through different routes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just a quick heads up, I'm going to open the floor for a couple of questions in a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to hear from Michalis on this directionality, standards and more.
Well, in terms of priorities, what we now recently presented the European Defence Industrial Programme, which is a legislative instrument with comes with 1.5 billion extra euros. We hope that this will go on fast. It's the discussion, the dialogue between the Council and the Parliament. This is how Europe works. We're not a super fast process, but it's a democratic process. Now, a bit on the future, because I would agree that in the current MFF, it was, as you said, but we also learned from this process, and let's not forget this is the first time that we had a defense program. So, if I read the way I read the President's political guidelines, is that we will have a new competitiveness fund. So that would be an instrument that would allow to go from R&D, that we already supporting, to procurement, which we already do, member states mostly, sometimes the EU also. We could cover what is in between, that Death Valley also. And that we may be able to do with the EU budget, but not only the R&D instruments, but also the other instruments, plus the work of EIB. Let's not forget that already now the EIB has 8 billion euros until 27. So you could expect this to grow because the notion of the need for security in Europe grows.
Is it being used?
Not as well, and actually that's why they go around the capitals to understand why. But the money is there. Hopefully they will be able, and we're very ready to help them see how to make it work, how to make it more attractive. The other thing is, because you also talked about many small projects, and then how do you have champions, which of course is true, but then of course you have to, there are different member states and then different priorities, and then you have to respect that. But again, in her political guidelines, the president proposed 2 concrete big projects. For the first time, she talked about defense projects of common interests, important projects of common interest, and she mentioned 2, the air shield and cyber shield, which obviously means that one should expect that they will come up with some concrete ideas of how these important projects will materialize. And to finish, we should also remember that the leaders, the 27 leaders, asked twice by the Commission to come up with proposals for funding, for additional funding. Because as you said, the MFF will never be enough, even if it's doubled. So this is possibly work that we will see in the near future, this additional funding that could make the difference. That will not come from the EU budget only.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to put to the panel? Okay, we have one at the back and one at the front, and I just encourage you to keep these to questions rather than theses and declarations.
Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epaphos Advisors. We represent here Uranian Heliospace and Defense Group. The question is, we agree with the industrial perspective, which is Mr. Luengo gave it very properly. And the question is, why don't we follow what the founders of Europe proposed in 1954, which was the creation, apart from the economic union which we have today, which we have to stop it here, as also the industrial sector proposes. Why don't we create the European Defence Community, where the technology and other advantages for Europe will bring us better results and will give another direction to our abilities with the other nations and territories. Also, our proposal to the citizens of Europe is giving a solution to the relation of the new entity with NATO, because we give a new approach for the NATO and a new direction for our allies so that we keep our advantage. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So, questions about European Defence Union, new direction, and so forth. We had a hand raised at the front here. If you could just bring the microphone forward.
Political question.
Thank you. And if you just introduce yourself as well, and then we have a third question here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Yeah, great. Hello. I am Yannick Morel from France, working at the Ministry of Health. To come back to a remark by the industry representative, you mentioned that you would prefer to have strong standards so that we don't have several parallel armaments. You mentioned several types of aircraft, etc. But what would happen if the EU standards are NATO standards leading to the buying of US systems?
Thank you. I like provocative questions. That's a great one. Okay, we have a third one here, the lady in the blue.
Thank you. My name is Christina Prokop. I am, NCP for the civil security part and NFP for the defense part. So I tend to look into both worlds, but from the innovation perspective. And in my view, we are very focused on defense right now, which is very good, but security is much more. And we had it at some points with the preparedness union, with the question of, is there a market, which is difficult for defense, but even more difficult if you're in the wider security area. And the comment about that, a lot of other questions also need our priority. So my question would be, how can we strengthen also innovation for the wider security part, where the situation gets really messy with a lot of actors involved, public, private, if we go to critical infrastructures. And linking these worlds up is, for me, the second step, also an important one that we need to discuss about. But how can we bring the wider security into this discussion, which is really defense-focused for me at this point of time?
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so 3 interesting questions. Let's go in order. So, founding mission of Europe, European Defence Community, new rationality, mission for NATO and EU together. It seems to me that with the pledge for the European Defence Union, that's happening, at least politically. Do we think it will happen? Right? The unions are very bold statements, but to get from rhetoric to reality is a... Okay, a new entity, but anyway, Michalis and then David, perhaps first.
We tend to forget that this has been an area that evolved from nothing to where we are now. I mean, it was the first time in 2016 that President Juncker went out and talked about the defense union, when at the time that we did not have EDF, we had nothing. We did not even have its precursor programs. There was simply nothing on defense. So from 2016, 8 years later, we discussed how to spend more than 10 billion euros. Actually, we spent like close to 20 billion euros already, if you count in military mobility and the support to Ukraine. And so this is now getting at the next level. So we're talking about the defense union. The defense union can have different instances. You mentioned one, there can be others. It's a political decision at the end of the day. But this, what we will have in the next MFF, in the next years, it will be stronger than what we have now, because the world around us changed. And it's not only the political analysts that see it, it's the citizen in the street who is affected by the chips that are produced in Taiwan and are coming late, so the car price goes high, the solar panels, everything is affecting the effect of technology in the security, in the wider security actually, not only in defense, is indeed felt by everybody. On your comment, actually, it's very interesting to see the European Council conclusions always come up with one heading: defense and security. And it is, although the discussion today is about defense, we realize that it is more than that. Defense is one, we consider defense as one important part of the security. And rather than talk about technologies, there will be more and more support for dual-use technologies, actually, probably, with full respect on the technologies that are purely civilian. Almost all of the critical technologies of today are dual-use. Biotech, semiconductors, AI, quantum, space, materials, they're all dual-use, which actually means that the development can actually support different areas in the context of security. And the last work on standards. Defense standards is something that we work on within the context of NATO. I mean, this is something that it could not and should not be done otherwise. Where, however, it is different, and you mentioned one good example, health, is the whole world of the technology standards that refer to technologies that are dual use. Health is obviously one, AI can be one, quantum can be one, and many others, where indeed there are commercial interests also. There are interests of national interests, and their discussion is very different.
Thank you, Michalis. Now, I think, David, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, very interesting questions. On the first one, I don't know. Why don't we create a new entity? I think we have many entities now, but in 1954, the Communauté Européenne de Défense didn't see the light because the French government at that time didn't want. And they decided to keep going with the national approach, which is legitimate. In any case, in the treaty, in Article 42 of the Treaty of the European Union, 42, you have the solution. The day that the European Council decides unanimously to go for a defense union, they do it. Easy. You need to agree, 27 member states. By the way, there is this concept of defense union is always in many papers. Julian King was commissioner for the security union. And security, dual use, civil policies, we've done a lot within the European Union, and the European Commission is in charge.
Skinas is now.
Sorry?
Skinas is now.
Skinas is now, but I mean, the concept of security union was already there. There is some funding for security research as well, which is important. And I fully agree on the critical infrastructure protection. I think this is one of the topics that we are not discussing about enough. There is regulation to organize a little bit the sector among the operators in order to upgrade their capacity, their capabilities, but we need to really understand that the modern war is not about what we see today in Ukraine. There are other issues that we don't see that are also there and related to the civil infrastructures, critical entities, etc. And on standards, I didn't say that I want American standards. What I say is that we need European interoperability. Very different. American standards, you have plenty of them, all of them. There is this concept of ITAR that Professor might know very well, better than me, on international trade agreement regulation. And this determines even who sells what to whom. That's a stronger start than that one. I don't know.
Okay, thank you, David. We're going to come back to one of these points, but first I want to come to Bryan and then Michael, if you have any further thoughts to add on these questions. But standards, defense union, complementarity with the NATO.
I'd like to major on the question about security. It's wider than defense, and how do we stimulate innovation on that? Very interesting question. Let me give NATO's perspective on this. NATO recognizes that as a political military alliance, it actually has quite a lot to contribute to civil resilience. So NATO has 7 baseline requirements on resilience, which are in the public domain. They cover things like support to the duly elected government of a nation, to resilient energy supplies, making sure that the nations are resilient to mass movements, whether that's as a result of natural catastrophes or climate change, etc. So we have 7 baseline requirements, and NATO can contribute to all of those. Let me give you just a few examples from the scientific perspective. So in terms of support to national governments, we as a scientific group actually did a lot of work in the early days of COVID on countering disinformation that was coming both from non-state actors, the anti-vaccine campaigns, through to some proven examples from state actors as well, spreading disinformation about COVID. We do a great deal of work on medical health, for example. That can contribute to helping nations deal with health crises as well. So we recognize, of course, that resilience is both a national responsibility and a collective responsibility, but there are things that NATO can do to help the civil side on that. Dual use. Absolutely, most of the new technologies are dual use. The point I want to make here is that we must recognize the dominance of the private sector in this area. We have only got to think of the major national private sector companies. They dwarf defense expenditure from governments. That means that defense no longer controls the future of these technologies. We must recognize that. It also means in areas like quantum computing, we can watch what the private sector are doing, and from a defense perspective, just come in and add that delta of work that is specifically defence on the back of the huge amounts of work that the private sector are doing.
Good point. I really like that strapline. The defence doesn't control the future of these technologies. You might borrow that for a future event. Michael, is there anything further that you'd like to add in response to these questions?
So, standards, I think. So I have a military medical background. And as all you guys who do medicine, you know we've got international standards, right? I think there is a specific thing about defense that is very different in, I think, space, and I'm very sure the medical field. In space and the medical field, there are standards which are basically open source. You can read them up. And that does not hinder the national industries from obviously being successful in what they do. In defense, we do not do that, especially in the land forces. I would go as far as saying every company has their standards, and it is a very complicated mechanism of sharing knowledge, which does not help the EU process, by the way. So I think going back to the standards, I think since NATO is already a very large set of standards that has been agreed on, of course, also the United States, I think you really only need to do basically an analytical step in between saying, okay, which standards make sense for the European Union. We're right now in a discussion in the industry and regarding EDIP, so the European Defense Industry Program. And from the industrial side, one big part of the discussion is how much Europe needs to be in European defense products. And that very much relates to your question. But I think if you consider the interest that obviously seems to exist in Europe, that we need to be, I'll use the phrase, although it's a bit a loaded phrase, strategic autonomy. If Europe is interested in being strategically autonomous in a way, and not separated from, but side by side with the United States, then we will have to look into common standards. And I think I think the line we have to walk along. Regarding that, I think sometimes there's time windows of opportunity for organizations. One was 1954. The game has changed since then. And now we live in a world where it's a lot of me having part of a cake and now discussing which part of the cake I'm going to give away, which is always a complicated discussion, which means I once talked to a politician in Germany from the Green Party when they were discussing, do we need a National Security Council? And that person said, doesn't make sense to have a council as an institution if it's still going to be the same players talking about stuff, right? So I'm not sure if we need another institution. We just need to find a common ground on which we can work. Last question. Yeah, I totally agree. We need to give up silo thinking. I mean, disaster medicine is basically a different set of vocabulary and way of thinking for disaster without medicine, right? Ukraine is a huge disaster, and it's not a military disaster. It's an infrastructural one. It's definitely one that simply has to do with humans and everything that relates to them. And if we are going to, on the one hand, invest into Ukraine surviving that war, or perhaps even winning it, depending on who you talk to, we will definitely want to invest in ourselves. Well, being at least, that's the thing with the disaster medicine. The risk is we always react to disasters. The perfect way of solving disasters is by being prepared. So, and that is an infrastructural question, a social one, a cyber one, obviously, and a military one, which is why I'm sitting here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. And it's also a great point on which to end, because our next session, starting at 12 o'clock, will be on health security. Later in the afternoon, we'll be talking about digital security and international cooperation. And then towards the end of the day, we'll be looking more about the next framework program, research and innovation funding, how FP10, EDF, and so forth are likely to fit together under the bigger picture of competitiveness, defense and security in Europe. But on that note, my sincere thanks to Michael, David, Michalis, and to Bryan for all of your openness and candor, and a lot of food for thought for the remainder of the conference. But for now, I invite you to take some coffee and some nibbles. And for our online audience, we'll see you back at 12 o'clock for the beginning of the health security session. So thank you very much.